Welcome everyone to the latest in a series of development and support webinars delivered by the NIHR Academy. My name is Lucy and I work at the NIHR Academy as the Development and Support Manager. This webinar, Creative Problem Solving, Critical Thinking, is delivered in conjunction between the NIHR Academy and Capfinity, our leadership programme partners, and will be facilitated by Tom Lawton. Tom has extensive experience in change management, facilitation and coaching, and is passionate about helping leaders to work effectively and in close connection to their core values. Tom, I'll now hand over to you.
Welcome, everybody. Yes, my name is Tom Lawton with Capfinity. Very nice to be working with you today. I've been working with NIHR on leadership program, as Lucy said, over the last I think we're 2 years pre-pandemic, and then it's been ongoing since. I was just having a look through to see if any names I recognize, and I'm not sure if we have met before. Lovely to see you pop up. I'll have a look again later on. So today we are looking at problem solving in particular, and critical thinking, and the creativity really coming in there, and one particular aspect of how we go about solving some of the big problems and the big challenges in front of us. How it is we can enter those problems, how it is we can get to the root causes, and how we can have a sense of whether or not we've solved the problem at all at the end of it. Now, just as Lucy said, if you want any questions at any time during the course of today's sessions, do put them as we go along into the Q&A box that you'll see down on your bar below. And just as it occurs to you, pop your thoughts in, and then we'll have a chance just to see which ones come up to the top that we will have a chance to all talk about at the end. If your chat is available, by all means, do put messages into chat, but please don't put questions into chat. Just any comments, maybe I'll pop things up on screen. You maybe want to put a comment in on the chat. It should be available to you as well. Let's get in just to start our thinking off. And I've got a little question that's going to come up on the screen. And it's a thinking one, this one. Have a think about what rule is behind this sequence. I'll go silent for a few moments. You have a think about it. What rule is behind this sequence? So there's several possibilities that could come out of this. First could be, might sort of jump out at you, well, they're prime numbers. So they're obviously, the next one is going to be 7, 2, 3, 5, 7. And up we go. Maybe looking at the first one that came to me is, well, there's a gap of 1 between the first one, and there's a gap of 2 between the second one. So there'll be a gap of 3 between the third, which makes the fourth number is going to be 8. Or maybe there's another one, which is multiply by 2 and subtract 1. So you go 2 times 2 is 4, minus 1 is 3, 3 times 2 is 4, 6 minus 1 is 5, 5 times 2 minus 1 then would be 9. And we've got one answer coming in as 2 as the next possibility coming up. So all of these go into quite complex reasons, to complex arithmetic rules in between, that sort of push us into, all of these are moments where we've gone into a complex rule to try and find what's going on. And this is a concept, it's an interesting little experiment that pulls up something called complexity bias when it comes to solving problems, where we tend to overcomplicate things, where we tend to look for the complex issues, where we tend to try and find what is going on. It's a very interesting phenomenon that pops up in all sorts of different ways, especially if the decisions we're trying to make are very big. We can be very averse when we're having a very big situation to wanting to find a simple problem underneath. So this complexity bias is a really important one just to get hold of. What we want to do is to move towards a subtractive mindset. So instead of saying, what's the complex rule, what's the complex issue in behind this problem I'm trying to solve, instead to go, what is the simplest way I could solve this? And the simplest way we could solve this, or the simplest possible sequence in behind, it is just a set of increasing numbers on the screen. So it could be 2, 3, 5, 123 as the next one come up. So this is our first part that we're going to be looking at. That complexity bias can impact problem solving because we can tend to overcomplicate the problem, overcomplicate the solution, overcomplicate our thinking. So a mindset we want to take into this is a subtractive one. It helps us focus on the problems that just need to be solved. It helps us focus our time and attention on where it will have the most impact. And it will help us actually get to the point where we can come up with the solution. So we're taking that as a framework. The actual model we're going to be working through is called the DIG model, the DIG framework. The DIG framework, which can help us as a framework that we can take into solving complex problems. Now, I'm using the word complex problems, and I'll just say something about what we mean by being a complex problem. Many of you here will be facing problems which are very perhaps technical in nature. A technical problem can be really tough to solve. It can take you years to get into it. But the thing about a technical problem is the outcome is quite clear at the end of it. The success criteria will be quite clear. If you've got problems and decisions to make along the route, it'll be quite easy for you to define which one is going to help us towards that technical solution at the end of that. Many of the problems we face, though, are going to be much more open-ended, and it's probably more towards these very open-ended questions that we are looking. Now, some of those could have a technical part in it, but it could also be how to engage people, get a cultural shift, how to get funding, etc., etc. All of these are a bit harder to define sometimes in scope. So complex problem is very much what we're looking at, rather than sometimes the more simple ones in front of us. I just want to reiterate, it's not to say that a technical problem is simple, but it probably is a bit easier to define its success criteria at the end of it. So just running through a quick overview, we're going to go to each of these in turn, what we mean by the DIG framework. Number one, define. What actually is the problem? What is the scope of the problem that we're trying to solve? Why does it matter? What do we want to achieve? And try to sort of define that as much as we can. And once we've got into defining what the problem is, then we can get into the next step, which is about identifying what is the root cause. Because very often we can get caught up in the symptoms of a problem. We can jump straight in. But by doing that, we just end up in a firefighting mode of constantly working on symptoms rather than really solving the problem underneath. The third part then is once we actually know what problem we want to solve and what good would look like, once we know what the root cause is, then we can get on to generating, where we can actually think about the solutions which will help in this. Now, many people, many leaders in organizations tend to have a bias towards one of these, which is towards generate. And the reason is that the success often in our careers becomes from being an individual who can find solutions, who can put them into practice. But that doesn't always help. Because if we dive in with solutions, we're missing out on that part underneath it, which is, well, are we solving the correct problem? Is the solution what's needed? Does this person in front of me at times need a solution? Or do they want to spend a bit of time generating? So, we've got a question for you. We've got a poll which is going to come up on your screen now. And the simple question is, which step of this do you find most challenging when faced with a problem? Which of these do you find most challenging when faced with a problem? So that's up on your screen now. If you could just click one of those options and press submit, and then we will share the results with you. For those on the recording, you won't be able to see the poll up on screen, but I will share the results. Just give about 30 seconds on this, if you can make sure you fill in your answer as soon as you can. Great, and that's just popped off, and here we go. What have we got? So, the one which people find the most challenging is defining what the problem is. That's 19% of you has said that. Identifying the root cause, that's our highest scorer, and that's at 49 out of 190, be 45, so I want my glasses on. Solve a problem. 45% identifying the root cause. And then generating the best solution, that is 36% of you. So we do have sort of challenges across the board. And I'm wondering if I did a flip side of it, which one are you finding most comfortable as to which one we would find? Great. Thank you very much. So we're going to spend each time on each of these steps in turn. Remember, do collect your questions, whatever's in the back of your mind, collect them up. And we've got a nice big chunk at the end for a Q&A to work through what comes up for you. Well, let's go straight on to our first one then, which is define. So the reason, excuse me, this is a really important one for us to do because, as I said, we do have a tendency wanting to, if a problem emerges, in whatever way that it emerges in front of us, whatever way we become aware of it, we tend to have a sort of desire to get involved with it as soon as possible. And that's fair enough. And of course, that's entirely natural. But if we get driven by that desire, what we will tend to go for is towards the issues which stand out. And the reason an issue can stand out is not necessarily because it's the most important issue. Very often it can be one which has an emotional charge to it, or that feels as though it's something that we could grapple with and get hold of and do nice and quickly and get out of the way. But as we know, in all areas of our lives, that doesn't necessarily work. Notice if you're incredibly busy and you find yourself, I don't know, tidying up your inbox, for example. That's not really the thing that's going to help you. It's just what's come up. It's emotional availability. I think it's another cognitive bias that sits underneath that. And so this is important, of course, because I'm now taking into your research work to think how many times have you stepped into and gone into a particular path of action before realizing actually maybe we should have gone in a different direction. Maybe this isn't the right problem to solve. And in my own experience, working, for example, in change management inside an organization I used to work in, I remember a big change program that we got into. We got into solving the problems and dealing with it and finding out who goes where and who does what. And then a year later, we realized that we had completely gone off in the wrong direction. And that was a very, very experienced leadership team that I was running. So how do we go about doing this? And a great way to define the problem is by using a concept called a problem statement. This is just a moment of stepping back, avoiding, pulling back from that sort of real temptation to dive in and get involved. Step back and just think about what's going on here. So I'm going to put up an example problem statement, then we're going to go through some component parts of it so you can have it as a toolbox for yourself. I can see there's a question in there. Do reminder, pop your thoughts into the Q&A as we go through. I won't necessarily be able to pick up on what's in the chat. So here's an example of a problem statement. So I'll read it out and just have a chance to think about it. We can't progress with the project until all the stakeholders agree on how we execute the plan. Without agreement, we won't meet our deadline, which will have a knock-on impact across several teams. A successful outcome would be for everyone to agree on a common ground and work on the same plan at the same time. Now, this is a very generic one. I'm totally aware of that, but we've got some very clear component parts to it. It starts off with saying what a clear description of the current situation is. We can't progress with the project because people aren't agreeing. A clear definition of what problem is that causing? We're not going to meet our deadline. A clear an explanation of why this is important because of the knock-on impact on other teams. And an explanation as well as to what a good desired outcome would be. For everyone to agree on a common ground and work on the same plan on the same timeline. So a statement like this, it's only what, sort of 6-7 lines. It's very short and to the point and really helps us get into making sure we are solving the right problem. It is absolutely key in problem solving that we do this part. A lot of problems come through problem solving because we go in too fast. It's not that people are necessarily lacking skills in being able to make the decisions out of the end of it. But of course, if we are not on the right track, if we're not agreed on what the issue is, then that can be very difficult. By the way, there's another issue there as well. It's another cognitive bias that sits underneath a lot of this. It's called transparency illusion. It's where we think that our innermost thoughts, feelings, needs, desires, priorities, views on a problem, successful outcomes, we think that those are really clearly written in our faces. We think that it's really, really obvious. And if it's really obvious to us, we think it should be obvious to other people. So very often, if we're working in a team collaboratively, we can look at a problem and go, well, there's the problem. Clear what needs to be done, isn't it? We all agreed, aren't we? Yes. And what's happening there is our brain is telling us that everybody else is seeing the same problem that we are. But the reality is that we don't. And so this as well is a very, very useful tool for collaboration, to making sure that everybody is understanding together what the problem is at the same time. Let's look at how we create this bit by bit. There's 5 questions that I'll pull up, and I'll encourage you at this point to bring into mind a particular problem that you're trying to solve, to see how it is that these apply to you. So, what's the problem you want to solve? What's the issue? Very important, by the way, as we go through these, and there's something in the construction of these questions the use of these questions to construct a statement, is to make sure it's clear, it's succinct, it's to the point, that your sentences are short and clearly definable. And that helps it clarify to us, and it helps us to clarify it to other people as well. So what's the problem you want to solve? Number 2, why is it important that you solve this problem? Now, because of course, that's a clear piece of communication, because other people have got their own problems to solve. And if you're going to be working with them, you've got to bring this up into their clarity of attention. So why this problem? Why is it important? Who is or will be affected by this problem? Again, in terms of communications to ourselves and to other people, sometimes we can get a little bit in a bubble about our own issues. And people can see that we can get a little bit of a bubble. But if we actually get out and go, no, this is important. Yeah, I'm trying to solve this, but the impact is on a lot of different others. It helps again with that engagement. What does your desired outcome look like? I'll give you a small scale example of this that came up a couple of weeks ago in a conversation. And it's a smaller scale one, but it just shows how we can often get caught up on the wrong thing. I was discussing somebody who needs to give feedback. It was a session about how to give feedback. And the person they needed to give feedback to was writing reports that went up to a very senior level, chief exec level reports. And these reports, there was a little piece of checking that the manager who I was training wanted to give to their team member about making sure that extra bits of checks came in. And the manager wanted to feedback to make sure the checks were done. So I said, what's your outcome? He said that they go through those checks. And I said, I can see that's what the outcome you want from the report, but what's the outcome you want from the feedback? And it took a while and a few more questions to get to the point. And this manager went, oh, I want a team member who's going to take ownership of that problem. I want a team member who's capable of solving this for themselves. I want a team member who's going to be fully independent in this piece of work going forward. Yes. What happened there is the manager got caught up with what they were going to do rather than what's the outcome they wanted to achieve. So we often mix up the process with the outcome, and making sure you really push yourself to go, no, if we succeed this, then what will we get out of the end of it? And making sure that that isn't a process piece. And number 5, what's the payoff? What's the benefit? What's the impact if this problem is solved? Now, you'll notice on this, these are all W questions. What, why, who, what and what as well. It makes it quite easy to write these. It makes it easily understandable. And this is an output we can then put into our problem statement. So it is a good tool, provided, and I'm slightly repeating myself here, it's easy to understand and really free from jargon. It should be focused and specific, and it should be concise. We're looking at only a few sentences here. Now it says 2 to 3. It could go a little bit more if you want to chop your sentences up. And it's worthwhile then looking again, does this crack the problem? And a good thing to do with the problem statement is to read it to somebody and go, does this get the problem across? Test it out, and then maybe go back and do a little piece of refining if there's anything which isn't clear, contentious, pulls up more arguments than it solves. So that's the problem statement. Getting us into the right point. Of course, we can't do effective problem solving if we're not solving the right problem in the first place, and we can't solve the right problem unless we define it. Check-in time, very brief example. A really sort of clear example of somebody who's gone through a problem-solving innovation process is James Dyson when he produced the vacuum cleaner. Now, he was a product designer of many years at that point, but he was using his Hoover, I think it probably was, and he was using and noticed that actually as the bag got full, it stopped sucking up dust. And so he had a bit of a problem. Now, if his problem statement had been, as in the outcome piece, I want to create a vacuum cleaner, or I want to, improve a vacuum cleaner so it doesn't have this problem, he wouldn't necessarily have got on to the pathway of innovation that he had. What he did instead is to say, I want to create a vacuum cleaner that doesn't lose suction as it gets full. That then opened him up into an outcome, which then led on into the further parts of the innovation process that he got into. So let's get into the next part, which is identify. Once we're clear about what the problem is, remember our piece about subtractive, we've got to make that as simple as possible, but of course no simpler. We need to think about what the root cause is. So we'll be doing this for the next few minutes to think about how it is we identify and dig down into the root cause of a problem, getting to the crux to it. This is another set of questions that we can ask ourselves. If, by the way, you find these processes a little bit hard to go through by yourself, you don't have to be getting a coach to help you. Just get somebody to take the role of a coach, a colleague, and somebody you work with, somebody in your team to help sort of push these questions out, if that would help you. I find personally that doing this on a piece of paper, I don't quite get the results as I would in conversation. So do explore your style of getting the answers to this question. Before we get into how we do this, though, we've got another poll coming up on screen now. Why do we need to get to the root cause of a problem? Why is it important to identify the root cause of the problem? Poll coming up on screen now. Thank you. Sorry, I just had to mute myself to cough, and so that locks me in. I'll do it in a different way next time if that comes up. So why is it important to identify the root cause of a problem? Single choice. It stops the problem getting worse. Yep. Only 1% of you said that one. It prevents the problem reoccurring. 24% said this. Now, a whopping 75% though said it makes the decision-making process easier when it comes to finding a solution. I really agree. However, you could say, actually, thank you everyone for that, that the answer could be any of those. Now, again, coming back to the reason why this is important, I perhaps will ask a question for you to sort of ponder for yourselves is, why might you sometimes get caught up on the symptoms? And do pop that into chat if you want to. Why can you get caught up on symptoms rather than root causes sometimes? I'll give you sort of an everyday example of what that is. Imagine I'm getting headaches all the time. Oh, symptoms. I've got to deal with this. Like I said, it's in front of my attention. I need it. So I get paracetamol. Okay, phew, symptoms gone. Problem solved. I can carry on with my day. But if it keeps going, well, I've probably got a bit more of a root cause there, and maybe go, actually, I haven't had my eyes tested for a while. Maybe that's causing some problems. And there it is. I do that, then problem solved. Thank you, comment in. A couple of you coming in, and just read some of that. We can have escalations on the symptoms on a regular basis, and you work on closing the symptoms. I think that is very much in the cycle of how much that the urgent pieces can often take up our attention, and we get in that cycle, which gets enabled as firefighting. Here and now, how so we have to deal with it first. Definitely, Sally's saying too close to the issue. We need to take a step back. Yeah, deadlines, pressure, trying to find her a shortcut. Sometimes it's the fear of the reality of the root cause. And I love that. You're right. I don't want to look too far. And whether that's just sort of fear of the root cause being something too big that I couldn't solve, whereas the symptom, of course, is something which is resolvable and in our power. But of course, that root cause is never going to be something that we start addressing unless we start taking those steps into it. Thank you all very much on that one. So here is a way that we can go about doing this. It's called the 5 whys tool. It's part of the Toyota production system, was actually created as a tool by Sakichi Toyoda, who was the founder of Toyota, to keep working on why something has happened. The methodology is quite simple. You ask or you get asked a question, why, about a particular problem. And then you pick up the answer and you say why about an element or the main element of the answer. And then you repeat that. Ask why, get the answer, pick up an element, ask why again. So let's get an example. We've got a problem, which is our project isn't going to hit the deadline. Why won't your project hit the deadline? First thing that comes up, because our stakeholders can't agree. Okay, so quite important on this as a use of it to make sure that your answers are quite short, because you want to be picking up one key thing out of that. Why can't your stakeholders agree? Because they've got different expectations. Why do they all have all different expectations? Because we've never agreed project goals with them. Why did you never agree project goals? Because we forgot to schedule a kickoff meeting. Why did you forget to schedule a kickoff meeting? Because we all have busy diaries and overlooked it. So here we're getting down to what the root cause is. Have a think what that might be. So our project won't hit the deadline because we have a lack of diary management. And that's systematic across the organization. And you could, if you want, 5 whys is a good number to get to. I think, you could probably go an extra couple on that one as to what's going on inside the organizational culture, which means that people aren't running diaries. Is there something where people are constantly coming out of their commitments elsewhere? So just having a look at this, if you say our project won't hit the deadline, if we just went into the first why, our stakeholders can't agree, right, we need to get together everyone to agree. But if we did that, we would be in theory solving the right problem because we need to get an agreement to hit the deadline, but actually all the underlying pieces, how we would go about getting that agreement, are dependent on what's underneath it. A way to sort of think about this as well is to go, well, when we start looking at the root cause we've got out, we can just do a little test. We take our problem statement and we take our underlying root cause. And we just ask ourselves, would solving this right cause help solve the problem? And that's a good marker to know that we're actually in the right place. Like I said, if it's not quite there, if it's a bit of a mismatch, or if you need to use the lots of layers at the same time, either you could carry on an extra couple of layers, make sure you're pulling the information out of each layer, because each of these layers is true in their own way. So here we go. The 5 whys has a long history in terms of complex solving problems, and a very, very useful one. It's one I've used many times in coaching and can be a powerful moment of reflection just to tuck in and find the causes underneath. So on to our last part then, which is around generating. Now, generating the best solutions to address the root of the problem. Notice not the problem, not the surface problem, not the first thing that comes to mind, not the first thing that feels most immediate, and most urgent, most emotionally available. It's actually what the root cause of the problem is. So the generation here is useful. The generation at the beginning as our first sort of impulse in there isn't going to be useful because we come up with lots of it that don't quite fit. So let's get into, for the last this pieces before we go to the Q&A, of how we go about generating ideas. I'm going to introduce you to two different kinds of thinking, and then we'll give you some tips about each. Divergent thinking and convergent thinking is two very different modes that our minds can get into to produce answers, to produce possibilities, to produce possible solutions to the challenge that we've clearly identified at this point and are working on. Divergent thinking is when we ask ourselves a question, and sometimes it can really benefit from questions which open up big gaps in our curiosity. Curiosity is an incredibly powerful human, I don't know what, I was going to say feeling, no, driver, that's it. It's a big driver that very often that we can just wait until it sort of pops in where we get curious about something. Or maybe something pops up on a screen, which gets us curious about finding the answers, a kind of some sort of clickbait, however well advanced it is. But we can also trigger that for ourselves. So if you ever want to get to a point of triggering your curiosity, then just ask yourself some of those big questions. I wonder why. I wonder what would happen if. I wonder what the cause of. Yeah, so those questions of I wonder, what they do is open up something called the curiosity gap. We have our current level of thinking. We've asked ourselves a question which is slightly out of that. And that gap is where the curiosity happens. And so if there are some things that you want to know about, just ask yourself those nice big open questions and then just see where your mind goes. And this divergent thinking is very unstructured thinking. And it's one which we don't do enough of. If I look back over my life, the time where I've done some really amazing divergent thinking is I'm like reading a book and then I stare out of a train window for a while. And something clicks and comes together. Of course, these days, what I tend to do is might be reading my phone instead. And so, having that time for that unstructured, open thinking pushed by curiosity, which we can either be there or we can push ourselves, is massively important to find out this open style. We'll give you some tips in a moment about that. Convergent thinking is when we've got our options and our ideas and we're starting to weigh things up against each other, see how they would fit in, see which solution is actually going to fit for this particular problem. And it's a much more that we're taking all the different possibilities and we're funneling it in into an actual few kinds of thinking which are really useful to us. So our last poll for today is, which thinking style comes more naturally to you? Poll up on screen. Which of these comes more naturally to you? The poll will be up in a second. There you go, just the two options, divergent thinking or convergent. Shouldn't take long, this one. See what comes up. Oh, wow. That's nice to see. We got divergent thinking 48% and convergent thinking 52%. Great, so pretty well balanced even. And 42, 58%, sorry, 52, 48% is pretty well even. I'll leave that one there. So we have a bit of both. Now, of course, both of these are absolutely vital. I love the history of science and always has done. I think it comes from having a professor as a dad who constantly sort of posed questions and thoughts and it's been a lifelong peace of mind. But it's always that sometimes we get big jumps in scientific advancement and breakthrough through perhaps some of the big divergent thinking. But then, of course, science isn't just made up of the big jumps. It's also made up of so many different pieces of that hard work, which is very much around the convergent thinking. Let's have some tips of both then to think about how we can do this best, how we can really make the most of these different styles. So number one, divergent thinking is resist the urge to set boundaries. Now, in this particular part, what we're trying to do in this part of divergent thinking is to create a space where it is okay just to wander around inside these ideas. And in that wandering around, we're going to come up with some ideas which could be really useful or some which could be completely just irrelevant. And in that, we do have the phrase, no idea is a bad idea. Now, that seems a little bit hackneyed, and some people are going, oh yeah, because of course some ideas are bad. An idea becomes a bad idea once it's put into practice. And that's the next step. In this particular space of divergent thinking, there aren't any bad ideas. And it's an interesting process where ideas get built up over time. And very often, especially in a collaborative moment, which will come in as one of our next tips, the process of divergent thinking means that we often bounce off each other's thoughts. I offer a perspective on this that opens up a perspective in somebody else's mind that they then add to, then add to, then add to. So it's an accumulative process as people go through this. It's important to protect this. And if you're a leader in the organization, recognize the importance of finding that space. A lot of this comes down to a concept called psychological safety. Is it safe for me to bring this idea out of myself and offer it out to other people? To highlight this, I'll give you this quote. I love this one. It's from Ovid, the Roman poet, 2,000 years ago. A new idea is delicate. A new idea is delicate. It can be killed by a sneer or a yawn. It can be stabbed to death by a quip and worried to death by a frown on the right person's brow. Now, that delicateness of that idea is a really important concept here, because ideas, even the biggest, I don't know, projects, initiative, they start at some point with an idea, that delicate idea that we need to implant and grow and make sense of. For those who are leaders of teams, just recognize how much influence that you have in that process. That sort of that frown on the right person's brow, that could be you. And that probably would be you. And the impact then on everybody else collaborating is like, oh, I came up with an idea. That person came up with an idea and they had that, no, that's not going to work. And then suddenly the safety created in that space in that moment is suddenly decreased for other people to bring their ideas in. And we don't know which one's going to be the best. We don't know which idea is going to trigger the best idea that's then going to be the one that we then take forward. So don't set boundaries on what the thinking can be. We might want to set boundaries on time. So give yourself more time to do this. Very often, it might only take 30 minutes of really concentrated divergent thinking, concentrated and protected divergent thinking, to come up with some really spectacular thoughts and ideas. So time box that time to give enough time for it. But of course, if you are in a process that needs an innovation coming through, innovation doing something different, creativity, this part, thinking something different, if you do need to move on, by all means, you can draw a stop to that at some process. And in that as well, if you need to give yourself time, if you get stuck, find some ways to sort of bring in different perspectives, get out, take a walk without any distractions or other thoughts, have a chat to somebody, I don't know, make yourself laugh. All of these are processes that can start waking up our ideas and our perspective shifting, which is so key here. And of course, collaborate with others. Those perspectives that we get, I've said, can bounce off other people, are absolutely vital. And sometimes ideas emerge out of nowhere on this one. I was listening to a podcast the other week about two scriptwriters, and they were scriptwriters for a Marvel film. Yeah, I know it's a piece of fiction, but it's still a $250 million business of creating these things. And they said this piece that stood out for me around creativity. They said, sometimes the ideas come from her, and sometimes the ideas come from me. And sometimes they emerge in between the two of us, where I'll say something, I can't remember their names, and she'll go, oh yeah, great idea. And I'll say, oh, that's not what I said, but let's work on it. And so I got this idea that emerged from this space in between them through mishearing, misunderstanding something. And then fast forward a year, we're on a kind of like a $5 million a day set where it's actually going into real life and it's having money spent on it. And it's a lovely example about how the collaboration can work at its very, very best. And if you find stories in podcasts, etc., of people who collaborated closely, I think it's just a lovely, rich process when we can get into it and do it well. You will often find that highly successful collaborative partners who do divergent thinking will be they'll be fiercely protective of that creative space where we're not doing the next step. The next step is this. We take those great ideas and we then do say, what are these great ideas that we created before? Do we need to check in, evaluate really, really clearly? Because at this point, we're starting to whittle out the ideas which don't work and make sense of the ones which could and really put into practice the ones that will. So this is convergent thinking. Protect your previous space, switch into this. Don't mix them up. As soon as you bring convergent thinking into a divergent thinking process, you stop it dead. And that's why when people are in brainstorms, for example, which needs some refinement to make it a decent technique to work, the yes, but, or that wouldn't work very often is just disencouraged or set to park it until the very end. So some ideas that we can have for how it is we can start to converge these ideas into a single point. Cluster your ideas into themes, see what's come up and start to actually see what patterns are in there. Are there any particular ideas? And what those themes are will be an emergent property. Establish your evaluation criteria. Now, we don't want to do this before. That unboundaried thinking before is useful in that part. In this part, we go, what would make a success? Now, part of this, a lot of the work is done if you then go back into your problem statement and use that. And if the work you've done on the D and the I, define and identify, is done quite thoroughly, then we're going to have this will be something which should be, I'm trying to avoid the word easy, should be more straightforward. And then rank or prioritize ideas. It's sometimes very, very difficult, especially when coming up with complex ideas, to come up with a solution where you are 100% satisfied. It might not happen. It might well be that you're 55% okay and 45% against it. If you are working with other people, there's lots of ways of doing ranking, for example, which can be useful. If you're all in the same room together, go and put a tick or a sticky dot against 3 ideas you like. You can also do the same version on online whiteboard or using something like Mentimeter as well. So we're coming up to the end. I'm just having a quick look at Shazia's comment. I think projects need to plan in the time needing for this type of thinking. I think you were in at the divergent point, you said that. Otherwise, it's usually time which will cause boundaries to be set in the first place. I think I understand you on that one, which is it's something that get lost in the hurry and thinking in some ways that we're saving time by chopping it up. Anyway, let's have summarize because I want to have time for a Q&A. When you got a problem, you dig. See what we did there? Use a subtractive mindset. We've got a tendency to overcomplicate, and when it comes to problem solving, that means we end up piling extra problems on and bringing in detail which doesn't need to be there. So have a think about the subtractive mindset. There's plenty of resources online for that, and I think we've got an article at the end which will be useful for you. Then get into the framework, define, get them clear on exactly what the problem is, what it matters, why it matters, and what the desired outcomes, rather than jumping into some of the next steps. When we've defined what the problem is, then we can find out what the causes are using Identify, a great tool we've used, an incredibly powerful, well-tested, well-tried, is to identify the root cause. Why? Take the answer. Why that answer? Take the answer. Why that answer? And keep going down. Before we get on to the generate, and I think I put probably most time on the generate because this is one which is often, it's one that it needs a really clear structure about it. And highly creative individuals will often have highly structured processes they take into their creativity. And that sounds like it's sort of two different things, but I think I've probably given the impression that it's not. Great. So out of today, you might want to start making some commitments. I'm going to open up into the Q&A in a second, but just some resources. You'll get a copy of these slides as well, including these further resources, and the details will come to you just at the end of how it is you can get all of those. But you've got, that's an HBR article, for example, when subtraction adds value. Are you solving the right problem? The 5 whys, thinking fast and slow. Ooh. I talked a lot about cognitive biases, and if you want to get to the root of cognitive biases, then Thinking Fast and Slow by the Nobel Prize winner Daniel Kahneman is extraordinary. One of those ones that really sort of, for me, just sort of completely reset about who I was and how I think, along with other thoughts there as well on podcasts and TED Talks as well. Great. So I said slightly less time than did plan originally, but here we have a chance then to open up for questions.
Oh, thanks, Tom, for delivering such an interesting session. So yeah, we'll open up to the Q&A now. There's still time for you to send in your questions by clicking on the Q&A button, and you can send the questions to us anonymously and upvote on the existing ones you want answering first by clicking on the thumb icon. So I'll just take a look and see what the most upvoted question is at the moment. So first question we've got are, problems are often complex and have multiple reasons or explanations why. With the 5 whys, how do you select the most pressing issue at each why?
Good point, Kirsty. It's a tough one to know and to be able to answer particularly. And I think where I've, in my experience, where the 5 why goes wrong is when I say, why is this problem happening? And somebody goes, oh, it's this and this, this and this, this and this, this and this. And I think that is what you're saying. How do I choose which one of those to dig into? If I'm coaching somebody, I might just say which one of those is really sitting up top for you, which one of those is necessarily the biggest problem. And if they can't define that answer, then I would go back into the define part of the process. Because if we're not able to see the single biggest problem, the chances are, even actually into the very first step, we might be into that over complex thinking and seeing how we can actually narrow it down. I think the point about this is that inside a complex problem is going to be a lot of smaller problems. Find out the solution to it, and then you might want to go on to the next smaller problem, find the solution to that. With that, it could well be that you find some very fundamental tensions. So you've defined a problem, you've managed to encapsulate a little bit, gone into why, got the root cause. Great, I need to solve this. Oh, but if I solve this, then I'm going to come away from this problem. How do I do more with less? How do I increase the capacity of my team without harming their well-being? You know, these can be two fundamental problems that sit side by side. And at that point, then there is a stepping into problem solving, which is almost like it's an extra challenge around that. We've got to grasp both of those. We can't just go towards one side and hope the other will go away. We've got to take both of those and think, how do I knit these together in some way? And use that sort of creative point to then take into your next part. Because there's a very sort of big answer. It's hard to know exactly what your context is without answering that. I hope that's helped.
Thanks, Tom. The next on the list, this ties in very much so. It's, what if I've asked myself why 5 times or more, but still can't pin down the root cause of my problem?
I'd say keep going. Go down another, 5 whys is the sort of the outcome of it. By all means, if you need to go down an extra few more. And just keep asking yourself, then I think it's to say, it goes to one of the last points I made around satisfaction, that very often we want to get 100%, this is the perfect solution. Great, I'm going to go for that. But inside complex problems, we are unlikely to get to that 100% certainty. I said right at the very beginning, we can sometimes have tough to solve technical problems where we can have 100% certain this is definitely the right thing to do. But problems which are much more open-ended, which involve people, involve culture, which involve many different moving parts in it, we might never get to the perfect solution. So although we're not necessarily getting a why which feels perfect, we need to then ask ourselves, is this a why which would have prevented this particular problem?
Lovely, thanks, Tom. So the next question with the most upvotes is, how do I balance divergent and convergent thinking? How do I know when to swap from one to the other?
Several different ways. Simple, how do you balance in between the two? Remember, whatever you do, don't try and do the balance in a single moment, making sure you split them apart, because one actively stops the other. And it could be one of two things. How do you know when to stop? It could be that moment you go, oh, that's cracked it, which I personally love. In practical terms, though, if you are on a tight deadline and you need to move on, then it is just simply a case of saying, of drawing it in. That's all the time we can give that creative part. I would just say, though, I like the question because you're talking about balance. Very often we can get into what's the problem? Let's do this. We can go from the identify into the solution we're going to take forward. And the problem about that is, and I briefly mentioned it as like a huge piece of learning from my sort of corporate years background, is that it's so easy to miss out that part of let's bounce around a few ideas, especially if you've got very experienced people in the room who've been there before, that have solved similar problems in similar ways. We can end up coming up with a solution which feels clear and coherent, might be delivered with authority and confidence, but there could be other ways to do this. And so I think the balance really on this one, and I think I put a lot of energy into it as a result, because it needs that space opening up on the divergent thinking. So.
Lovely, thanks, Tom. I think we've got time just for one more question. So that one is, it makes logical sense to define the problem first. Focus on the problem, not the solution, is a familiar mantra. But why do we often jump into solution mode against our better judgment?
Yeah, I think hopefully I sort of come on to that. And I think it's because urgency is up in front of our faces. It's something called either recency bias or emotional availability, which come up as well, which is the thing that we remember. Or it could be, and so those are sort of personal relationships we have with the problem. There could also be systemic issues as well. What do you get rewarded for? What do you get noticed for? What do you get congratulated for? What do you get any kind of disapproval in the organizational culture if you don't do it? These can often then be pushes why we want to get into solve too quickly. Also, it's a default a lot of us we have is that if we have a problem brought to us, we think that if I'm going to help the person or people in front of me, they must want solutions. But of course, sometimes we just need a chance just to talk it through and open it up. So personal issues, personally wanting to help, and also systemic issues as well can be behind them.
Lovely. Thanks again, Tom, so much for delivering this. It's been a really, really useful session. Hopefully everyone's found this webinar beneficial and feels able to implement some of the behaviours we've explored today. As I mentioned at the start of the webinar, for those of you joining us live, as we close the session, you'll be asked to complete a quick evaluation form. The link is also available in the chat. This will give you the opportunity to share your email address so that you can receive a copy of the slides. And if you have the time, please do provide us with your feedback. All of our past webinars can be found on the NIHR TV YouTube channel under the Development and Support Webinars playlist, and you'll find a link to this in the chat box. You'll also find links in the chat box for our online leadership development resources on NIHR Learn, and these are available to anyone to utilise. We've just released a suite of new e-learning modules, so highly recommend you go and check those out. Also, NIHR Academy events page, so you can be kept up to date with up and coming events. Thanks for your time again, and I hope you enjoy the rest of your day. As always, if you have any questions or queries, you can contact a member of the development and support team at the email address provided in the chat box. Thanks so much.